Hi, this is Rob Pierce of worshipbasics.com, and welcome to my tutorial on the reluctant pastor. What if your pastor is reluctant to start a contemporary worship service? Suppose all the leadership of your church is on board and you finally decided to take the plunge and start a contemporary service at your traditional church. But you've got a pastor who's a little bit nervous about it. How do you handle that? Well, first of all, your pastor might be worried for a few reasons. He might be worried about how the congregation will respond, especially older members of the church. And let's face it, he might be kind of justified in that. Especially with smaller churches, if you have older, faithful members of the congregation that have been especially financially supporting the church for a long time, he could be pretty nervous about offending them. He might feel threatened by the addition of a contemporary worship leader. If you're the pastor, you are the shepherd of the congregation, and you might feel a little bit reluctant to have somebody in another position of leadership up front. So it is a concern for some pastors. He might also wonder if he'll have the time and energy for adding another service. You may already have 2 Sunday morning services, and adding a third, he might just be very reluctant and very nervous about that. It will take a lot more time and energy, and contemporary service is not as easy to plan as a lot of traditional ones are. So it's something to be concerned about. Well, let's talk about the congregation first. First of all, you should acknowledge that there may be a problem, that there is a decent chance that some members of the congregation are not going to be thrilled with the idea of adding a contemporary worship service. So acknowledge there might be a problem. But you should really try your best to frame it as an outreach, that it's a missionary effort of the church to reach the unsaved in your community. A lot of churches are having a hard time connecting with a newer generation, and a contemporary service is a good way to try to bridge the gap. You should also try to begin with a time that won't affect the traditional service if it's at all possible. If you hold it at a different time, and sometimes in a different location, such as the fellowship hall, then it won't nearly affect the traditional service as much as if it were held in the main sanctuary or at a time that would directly impact them. You can also watch a tutorial I have on my website, worshipbasics.com, that talks about how to help members of the congregation see this as a missionary effort, and other tips and tricks that you can kind of do to help get everybody aboard on this enterprise. If the pastor feels threatened, there are some things that you can do there too. First of all, you should pretty firmly establish the role of the worship leader before you even choose one. Make certain that you get things down on paper, have a nice, clear job description about what the person who you hire or the person who is appointed as the worship leader is supposed to do. Make sure the boundaries are clearly drawn. You should also choose a worship leader who's going to respect the leadership of the pastor. During the interview process, when you have a clear job description, you can make it understood that there are certain things that the worship leader will be in charge of and certain things that the pastor will be in charge of. And you can choose wisely to make sure that you get somebody in there who is going to respect the pastor's leadership. You should also follow the leading of the Spirit. But as a worship leader, you can't ever use that as an excuse to take over. And I have seen this in churches. Sometimes you'll just get a hotshot worship leader up there who's a really good musician who will just repeat things on and on ad nauseum and claim that the Spirit is leading him to do this and the Spirit is leading him to do that. And next thing you know, you look at the clock and the usual length of the service is an hour and a half, an hour and 15 minutes has gone by, and then you're going to let the pastor preach. An order of worship, we really do need to have a controlled order of worship, and you can't let the leading of the Spirit be used as an excuse just to run roughshod over the senior pastor. So that is something that you have to make sure should be a consideration. The energy and the time in the pastor, this is a concern, especially depending on the age of your pastor. Sunday morning is his busy time. It's the time he prepares for all week. Adding a service is going to take more time for your senior pastor. It is more difficult. And the services involve more planning. It's more planning intensive. A good idea is to think about doing a team approach. If you can have some people help him to put together the service, maybe split things up into different areas of responsibility. And if you could just, as much as possible, just save the teaching and preaching portion for the pastor and let everything else be taken care of by people that are working under his leadership, it'll make things a little bit easier for him. Also, some churches do a completely different service for the contemporary service. If you have a pastor who's willing to do that, that's not a bad idea. A completely new sermon, everything different, special outreach towards the unchurched. That's great if you can manage it, but it's an awful lot to ask of a pastor. In some churches, it might be more wise to have the pastor preach the same sermon at all the services Sunday morning, but you could introduce some new elements in the contemporary worship service that would just help back him up. Maybe some drama, video presentation, or certainly through the worship choruses. You can use the same sermon, but kind of spice it up for the contemporary service too. You can also share the load. You can ask the lay leader or an associate pastor to help too. Or if you have an associate youth pastor, maybe you could have that pastor be solely responsible for the service at the contemporary service, and the main pastor can do the preaching at the other services. Once again, though, it is in the end the pastor's decision. He's the leader of the church, and he's the one who should be comfortable with what the decision is. A few things to remember. You can't begin with a willing congregation and an unwilling pastor, and you can't begin with a willing pastor and an unwilling congregation. To start a contemporary worship service, you have to have the support of both the pastor and the congregation, at least partially. And the last point here I should mention is, you are never going to have 100% of the members of your church behind any change in the church. Some people are just absolutely resistant to change, and you will just never have 100% participation, excitement about what you're doing. So if you're waiting for that, you will wait for all of eternity. But there are some things that you can do to help alleviate the pastor's concerns. And as long as you are willing to make sure that he's comfortable with what you're doing and make sure that the congregation is on board, there's a good chance that you'll have a successful service. Well, good luck and God bless.